Yeah. Well, hello. All right. Thanks very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being a part of Colloquium for everybody. If you don't know me, my name is Brennan Breed. I am an associate professor of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. I have been there for, about 8 years now. So some of you may not remember me or know me yet, but everyone here knows Dr. Walter Brueggemann, who we are welcoming back to be with us again today. This is a speaker who doesn't need much introduction here. Oh, there's some background noise. Thank you. Yeah, if we might want to mute ourselves unless you're speaking, and feel free to use the chat function, by the way, to ask questions or make comments and things. But our speaker today needs no introduction for this audience, I'm sure. But nevertheless, Dr. Walter Brueggemann is the William Marcellus McPheeters Professor Emeritus from Columbia Theological Seminary and the author of well over 100 books. I heard recently 130. I'm going to admit I didn't take the time to count, but countless articles and many podcasts now, many articles in things like the Christian Century, but the most important part of his career, I would say, is that he has changed the landscape of biblical studies for the 20th and 21st centuries. He's got 2 centuries of really game-changing studies and books, and someone to whom all of us, I am sure, owe our deep gratitude and thanks for the ways that he has shepherded all parts of the church, the evangelical church, the mainline church, the progressive church, into new understandings of the Bible, of the church itself, of our covenantal duty to our neighbor and to the common good. As a personal note, I got interested in biblical studies as someone who had just graduated from college. I didn't quite know what I wanted to do with my life. I was in Virginia Beach. I was teaching algebra and working at a church with the youth there. And I was in a Barnes and Noble in Hilltop, the shopping district in Virginia Beach. And I happened to notice a commentary on Genesis written by Walter for the interpretation series. I picked it up, and a couple of hours later, they kicked me out of the store. I was sitting there reading it while drinking a coffee, and bought it, went home and read the rest of it. And then I said, this is what I want to do. I want to read stuff like this for the rest of my life. So I owe my entire career really to that moment sitting there in that Starbucks. So, or that, the Starbucks cafe attached to the Barnes and Noble. But in any event, so my own deep great thanks are in order here. But one thing I'd like to say before we set out is that we will be talking today mainly about Dr. Brueggemann's book, Virus as a Summons to Faith, the Biblical Reflections in a Time of Loss, Grief, and Uncertainty, which came out last year from Cascade Books, an imprint of Whips and Stock. But feel free to ask questions and make comments and so on that touch on other aspects. But I'm going to be asking mainly questions about the past year and interacting with Dr. Brueggemann's work in Virus as a Summons to Faith. So, Walter, thanks so much for being here.
I'm glad to get to be there, and particularly to talk with you, Brennan. And I'm glad we're on the same page about Old Testament studies. And as I have remarked about you and Davis Hankins, that your research has gone well beyond almost anything I understand, and I keep learning from you, so I am grateful for that.
Well, I appreciate that. I really doubt there's anything I can teach you, but I appreciate the gesture, and Davis and I both appreciate that very much. Thanks so much for staying engaged with what's happening in biblical studies as well. There's one professor I had who will remain anonymous who said when he retired, I'm just going to go fish. But thank you for all of your work, that you have done for the church and continue to do, this included. So let me jump into our topic for today. So in Virus is a Summons to Faith, you outline a variety of biblical understandings of pestilence and plague. And this goes along with one of your longstanding contributions to the field of biblical studies, which is to encourage us to listen for different voices within the biblical text and to take seriously the different witnesses that we see in those voices. So instead of just noticing differences in the text and assigning them to different historical eras or something, instead trying to hear the witness that they offer. So these different understandings of plague and pestilence and so on that we see, you emphasize the transactional mode of covenant. That is kind of a quid pro quo. You know, if you do poorly, God might send pestilence. That's Deuteronomy, right? Says that kind of logic.
Yep.
It's a part of the biblical tradition. It's a part that some of us don't emphasize very much these days, but nevertheless, it's part of the kind of orderly world that people can live in. But you also point out that sometimes God sends things like plague and pestilence as part of other things like natural disasters and so on in order to deconstruct systems of hierarchical power that are oppressing people. And this happens again and again in the text. So in Exodus is a great example of this, but also like the exile. Jeremiah understands the exile is in a way an unbuilding of what had become an oppressive structure. But you point out as well that sometimes God is just free and sovereign, and God doesn't have to explain. And there are even mysteries associated with this, like the book of Job. We can't get into God's head sometimes and know why God allows these things or sometimes sends them. And then you point out as well that sometimes God even uses things like the plague without necessarily causing them, almost a bit like Joseph, who doesn't necessarily say that God made me be sold into slavery, but he says that God used this as an opportunity to do something good for the world. So with all those different ways that you're encouraging us to listen carefully to the text and all the variegated witness that the text has, and then to listen very carefully to our own cultural context, and one or more of those may actually be applicable at one time. I do. There was one thing I wanted to ask though about all this, which is that within your work, all of those reference God as the author of life, God as the kind of font of everything that lives, of the cosmos itself. What many people today have experienced during the time of COVID, when they think about the virus, is in some way kind of like just health guidelines. Here's what you need to do to stay safe. Some people flout those, some people follow them. And then this kind of waiting for the vaccine, waiting in a way for the vaccine to help us, to deliver us from this kind of bondage, this isolation that we've been in. Of course, we all want a scientific understanding of the virus, of public health procedures, the vaccine, and so on. We're deeply grateful for those people who work to undertake it. But is that all there is? What do we gain practically from a biblical interpretation of the COVID-19 pandemic that we would miss if we just think of this as kind of a scientific anomaly and nothing more? In other words, what does the Bible give us as resources to understand this event that science alone can't?
Well, I don't think there's a straight line answer to that, but we can walk around it. And obviously, the Bible thinks that we ought to practice prudence about the things that we can gain from science or whatever. We ought to use good sense. We ought to use the knowledge that we know. But I think that the Bible, on the whole, believes that the sovereignty of God outruns all of our prudence and all of our, just a minute, the phone's ringing here. All of our prudence and all of our knowledge, and that we can trust that at the bottom of reality is the faithful sovereignty of God. And in the Bible, all of the ways of thinking about the plague or the pandemic that I could identify, they all assume that those are subject in some way to the rule of God and do not outflank the rule of God. Mm-hmm. And if we have the sense that a pandemic can outrun the rule of God, then I suppose what we have to say is that our God is too small. If you look at the great doxologies in Job, for example, there is nothing small about that God. So it seems to me that what the church and the pastors of the church have to do is to be grateful for all of the prudence that we can muster, but then also to invite people to the doxological wonder in which we can rest our lives when we reach the edge of our prudence. So I think it's a kind of a both and. I don't think it's an either or. And I think that's the kind of wisdom that our church tradition has always championed, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I mean, speaking of things seeming small, our theology can sometimes try to constrain God or make God small. One thing that's felt small for a lot of people this year is our worlds. Our worlds seem to have shrunk, sometimes to the size of our house or our apartment. For the past year, the common experience of COVID for many people has been isolation and loneliness, combined with kind of a sense of the future that seems kind of vacant or unpredictable. And you've written in the book about the cancellation of major events and the kind of pushing things off into some kind of vague future in which we don't have a day or a time and so on. We can see all these psychological studies and medical studies that show us the real costs, the health costs, the psychological costs of prolonged isolation, lack of human touch, and things like this. In your work, you've long stressed the common good as the communal nature of covenant fidelity. One of the ways we enact the kind of the script of our covenantal fidelity to God is through a concern for the common good and for neighbor. For the common good, we've had to kind of remove ourselves from the public sphere, or at least many of us have over the past year, which is a bit paradoxical, but many of us, for the sake of our communal well-being, have had to do that. And a lot of us are looking at other people and seeing them as vectors of disease now. Have we lost something important in the meantime, or is anything gained, in your opinion, that, say, for example, this sustained discourse about the common good and the fact that people are socially distancing for that purpose? Do you see ways that covenantal faith has changed in the past year, or stresses to it?
Well, I think we have had great losses, but I suspect, and in my old age, I'm not much of an example of this, but I think we probably have to rethink our social distancing. In the little town where I live, the amazing ministry of the churches together toward our homeless population and toward our food disadvantaged people goes on. And people are out there and people are engaging in neighborly stuff. I suppose you'd say in very careful defiance of social distancing. And this is a very tricky matter, and I'm not making any very urging about it, but I'm astonished in my community that there are people who believe that the mandates of the neighborhood override self-protection. That doesn't mean doing foolish things, but it does mean doing risky things. And I think that the church has to go on talking about the neighborhood and about the common good and about the infrastructure. And here and there, the saints of the church take the initiatives that they're able to take about that. I think it's quite extraordinary, and I don't think anything that would happen if it were not communities that were grounded in the truth and the reach of the gospel. So that's our subject.
Right. Stephanie Coble-Hankins is a great example in Boone, North Carolina, graduate, alum of Columbia Theological Seminary. In the wake of the pandemic, Stephanie organized food distribution to one of the poorest communities, one of the poorest counties in North Carolina that has terrible food insecurity. And it was risky and difficult to do precisely because of the pandemic. It's not like people were not wearing masks and things, or meeting inside. It wasn't involving that, but it was trying to work for people in that moment of crisis. It's interesting. Catherine Keller and Bill Brown have, and other people have pointed this out, that what happened in a way with the pandemic was a bit like an apocalypse, not the end of time, or like like those movies like The Road or something, but instead an unveiling, like a removing of certain blinders that some of us have on that we don't see, right? So people who are considered essential workers but are not paid much and are considered disposable, are not given access to vaccines, and so on. So some people in positions of privilege have begun to see some things that were kind of hidden for us before from the pandemic. One of the things that came from that, of course, last summer after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and others was the Black Lives Matter protests, which were kind of radiated beyond cities into communities in far-flung places. I saw a protest at a friend of mine in rural Idaho took part in a Black Lives Matter protest. You wrote about the Copernican revolution, kind of like the Copernican revolution, this turning in a way, and an opening up of people to listening and thinking about injustices that they maybe hadn't before. So as you write in the book, you wrote, the prophetic imagination is the anticipation of new social possibility that is available from the intention of God and the prophets. What is required of us now is not simply fantasy, but moral imagination to express historical possibility that is congruent with God's hope for neighborliness. So as we reemerge over the next few months, how do we use this opportunity now of unveiling to guide others in a transition into a community focused on the common good? Or do you see other new opportunities here?
Well, I suspect there are new opportunities about which I don't know anything. A long time ago, Will Willimon, when he was a bishop, wrote that he was visiting a church and there was a guy washing dishes in the kitchen that served food for the homeless. And his cheeriness, Will asked the guy, does this work bring you great satisfaction? And the guy said, I hate it. This is where God put me. And then he said to the bishop, where did God put you? And I think that this may be a time when the God question gets refocused for us around the issue, where is God putting us? And God is putting us in new places where we had not thought to go, which of course is what Jesus always does to his followers. He puts them in new places where they had not thought to go. And I think probably we're not going to return to any old normal. I think that's gone and beyond us. And what we have to do is to decide what risks have to be run for the sake of a new normal that has moral credibility to it. And I think that requires the church to do its really best, most daring thinking, sort of outside the box of what we had taken for granted about all of these matters.
Yeah, it seems to me like when things open back up, when we reach herd immunity with vaccines and so on, that there's going to be a hunger, like a passion for community in a way that, or maybe even just being around people in a way that we haven't seen before. But also there's going to be some needs, not just material needs, but also some psychological needs.
That's right.
I would imagine that children who have been isolated for a long time, haven't been in school in a year. My kids are still learning virtually and haven't, it's been disruptive and disturbing. And I do wonder about these kind of long-term costs, but also about those opportunities that will produce themselves. I mean, we did like a little outdoor service at a church in Decatur near the time of Christmas. It was like a lessons and carols thing, distance, outdoors, masked, and so on. And it was cold, and people were walking up off the street, just kind of standing there just to be a part of something. And the one guy came up to me afterwards and said, I haven't been in church in 30 years, but it was just nice to be around people. And he said, that was the first time I heard the story about Jesus in a long time. I think there might be some new opportunities, but I wonder, and I wonder from folks who are joining us here too, I wonder where some of those opportunities might be. And that's not a question necessarily for you, but where, but I think that's going to, you're right. There's going to be an unveiling, kind of opportunities that emerge. We need to keep our eyes open, I guess.
Right.
But
I think pastors are going to have the tricky task of negotiation between those who want to restore the way it was, and particularly young people who do not want to restore that, but want to do something that matters and is concrete. And that's a negotiation that's going to have to happen in every congregation, I think, or we'll end up with old people like me who feel comfortable in the way it used to be. And that's an act of disobedience to the gospel, surely. Yeah.
And I mean, how do you think this rupture might change the role and function of the church, or the role and function of a pastor within communities of faith? I mean, how is it going to change preaching? I mean, I've already seen some great changes in the way that people try to think about the creating and delivering online sermons and things. But what do you think are some of the long-term possibilities and effects of this on the pastorate?
Well, I don't really know, but I think the pastoral job is going to be negotiation, as I just said. It's going to be teaching young people who do not really grasp or live in to the defining narrative we have. It's going to require preaching that is less escapist than much of our preaching is, and is going to require us to focus on the meta-narrative of the crucifixion and the resurrection, and how we perform crucifixion as resurrection in the life of the community. So I think it is in some ways really turning back to the basics, when after our Constantinian privilege has given us the luxury of taking the basics for granted. And I don't think we can take the basics for granted, not only for younger people who don't know, but for longtime members who have become accustomed and jaded and lost the bite of what this narrative is about. So I think it is, I think it's going to be a very hard time for the church and its pastors, but I think it's going to be a wonderful time, because it turns out that we've got the narrative that can be the door to the future. And it is a narrative of crucifixion and resurrection that we have to find courage for, not only to tell, but then to embody and to live out. And I think that's a kind of a refocus from much of the practice of ministry that has been an endless series of minor jobs, and now a focus on what's at the center. I think there are examples of this in the faithful church, for example, in East Germany, before the Iron Curtain fell, that those pastors had to do the hard work on the main issues. And I think in some ways, that's our new context for this.
Yeah, and you mentioned negotiation, that there are going to be a lot of things we have to negotiate, but also the crucifixion there. And that's one thing in your work that I've really appreciated over the years, is that you tell us that we can't shy away. We can't, sort of move into the Joel Osteen happy church, positive, name it, claim it sort of thing. There are happy parts of the Bible. There is a resurrection, but you have to stick through the crucifixion. You have to actually embody, in a way, grief. And articulate grief, and that's an important part, not only of our faith, but of what it means to be human. So, I mean, I'm really grateful about that. I'm really grateful for the way you talk about prayer in the book, the chapter on prayer, where you talk about how it can't be ideology, thoughts and prayers to kind of push an issue under the rug that you could fix otherwise, or magic thinking that can disappear tomorrow and so on. If let's pray and God will fix things. But you name in the last chapter that the groaning that is a part of the articulation of faith. It strikes me that there's been, at least overall in the U.S., there's been 500,000 people who have died. There's been very little public articulation of the groaning. There's been kind of a get back to work message in some ways, or socially distance and keep your attitude up in a way too. But the articulation of grief, the public remembrance of tragedy, it's been kind of left behind.
Right.
I know that some pastors are doing this in our churches. I'm just wondering, how would you suggest or encourage us to share this groan at a time when people are going to be so excited to get back to normal, or get back to a happy summer or travel, and forget about all this, when we maybe haven't processed the grief and trauma in a way that the Bible suggests.
Jews and Christians, we're the only ones that have the text to do this in the lament Psalms. And I think that not only do we need to do lament over the 500,000 or however many it's going to be, but we have to lament the passing of white superiority, of patriarchal domination, of American exceptionalism. These are over, and I do believe that if the church could find effective ways of helping people grieve in order to relinquish, it would siphon off much of the adrenaline that is feeding Donald Trump. I think that Donald Trump is essentially an act of nostalgia for the way the world used to be. And until we relinquish our hope for the way the world used to be, we'll never get out of this box. So what laments are acts of hope for what God will yet do. As you know, they are also acts of relinquishment, that what I have now lost is gone and it is not recoverable. And I think, hard as that is, the church is the only place in town where that can be talked about and sung about and processed. So we've learned a great deal about grief work for individuals in their personal losses and deaths, but we've only begun the work of communal loss, and of course the Book of Lamentations and all that stuff is ready at hand for us to do this. The last place we'll get to it is in the lectionary, because the lectionary committee is designed for a happy church. We just do not expose ourselves to these laments. Right. There they are. So right. Give it a try.
I love the book that you wrote, Reality, and then Grief, and then Hope. That's the prophetic cycle, but also the cycle that the Psalms teach us, that there has to be truth telling, and honesty, which can be brutal at times, but then there can be a stage of actual grief leading people through true grief, and then there can be hope, but only in that order. And that's I think a really powerful word for us right now too.
And the pastoral good news is that to do the grief work of truth telling is not hammering people, it's not scolding people, it's not making people feel bad. It's inviting people to get in touch with what they know in their own lives, but can't afford to acknowledge, which of course is what all good therapeutic work is about. The things we know that we can't acknowledge. And that's a great opportunity.
Yeah, and it does. Yeah, you're so right that it doesn't involve shame, which I feel like is a major part of our discourse right now. Our cultural discourse is trying to shame particular people, which maybe they need sometimes, but also it strikes me like Donald Trump, right? You mentioned him as kind of like a lightning rod for people's anger. I mean, he deserves it, in my opinion, rightly so. But once the big man leaves the stage, right? There are still things to do, and we still need to raise awareness and attention about things, without the lightning rod necessarily. So, I mean, one thing I'm passionate about is raising the minimum wage. Now, I understand people are all over the board politically, economically about that, but it strikes me that we could push forward with recognizing essential workers and rewarding them for their work, rewarding them for their dangerous work that we've just gone through. And that's one thing where we might not have the political will to do that. And we can't blame it on one man anymore. But all to say, I think we've got to think through this crisis, but also think through our role as a leadership, in leadership. Can I ask you? You mentioned the lectionary. I took a look at the lectionary for the next 3 weeks in Lent, and Lent might be a good time actually for Old Testament folks like us to intrude upon people. The next 3 weeks, the Old Testament text in the Revised Common Lectionary is Exodus 20, it's the 10 Commandments, And then it's Numbers 21, which is the serpent, the bronze serpent, which is an interesting one having to do with plague, right? And God's sovereignty. But then, and it's paired with John 3. But then Jeremiah 31 and the new covenant is the week after that. It strikes me that there's a potential Brueggemannian cycle there for 3 sermons where you could have, Exodus 20, the reality, right? No idolatry, care for God, care for neighbor. And the reality that we haven't done that, none of us have lived up to these and embodied these in the ways that we should. And then Numbers 21, right? The kind of grief, right? There's kind of a price to be paid in a way for this. Our idolatry and our lack of faith in God, our lack of care for our neighbor. And then Jeremiah 31, we kind of get this new hope in a way. So do you have any thoughts on those texts for folks who might be preparing sermons in the next 3 weeks?
I think your thoughts are very good about all that.
I stole them from you, but yeah.
The amazing thing about Jeremiah 31, I think, as you well know, it says, I will remember their sins no more. You can start new and move into the future because you have got the stuff written on your heart. It's not an imposition. It's not a burden. It's not a chore. It's a vocation, and you have freedom for that. So I think that text in Jeremiah 31 is really an amazing emancipation. And as you know very well, Brennan, it's not very much before that in Jeremiah, either in 30 or 31, where you get Rachel is weeping for her children and she cannot stop weeping. So that would be a good segue to get into the newness that God responds to this weeping that simply will not stop. So to get that dialectic might be very useful for that.
Yeah, and the pivot to new orientation that always comes from where we know not. In that moment of newness. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. There's a question that somebody asked on the chat that I think is there's a couple of different questions. One of them is, must we relinquish denominational divisions? Which is a big question. But on another note, how can this moment help us overcome the myth of scarcity that underpins the putative necessity of capitalist production? So this, we have seen, and you point this out in the book, in the midst of the crisis, a kind of at first, great scarcity of toilet paper, among other things. But then there was this kind of, we saw checks come out of nowhere. We are hoping to see more. But as to say, there was this kind of, one of the unveilings was that there is forced scarcity, or there is scarcity that is kind of produced among us. Yeah. And there were moments where that was kind of unveiled in a way. Do you think that we can begin to work on? I mean, there are people talking about forgiving debts, college debts, and so higher education debts. Do you think that was that a moment that opened and closed, or do you think that there's a potential future liberatory moment here?
Well, I have 2 responses that may or may not be useful. The first one is, I have been reading in what is called modern monetary theory, and it is a theory that the government cannot run out of money because it makes money.
Fiat currency, yeah.
And as long as you guard against inflation, there is no limit to the money that the government can make, which means that austerity is an unreal moral program. So we argue austerity on economic grounds, but in fact, it is a moral issue that we do not want somebody to get something free, particularly blacks and poor people. So the overcoming of austerity in terms of the federal budget is a recognition that we live in an economy of abundance. The second response is, I think when the church celebrates the Eucharist, which it ought to do more often than it does, we shouldn't have these little pieces of bread. We should have huge loaves of bread so that all the faithful can be satisfied with enough left over to take out to where it is needed in the neighborhood. This would be a dramatic sacramental gesture to issue a wake-up call that God's world is filled with 12 baskets of surplus bread for all the tribes. It's astonishing that we reduced the sacrament to parsimony, and then we get into arguments about who ought to get to eat because we don't want everyone to have this. Just certain people are qualified. It is a sacrament of parsimony, and we need to change our thinking about that.
Yeah, that first century church that had the feasts, right? The love feasts,
That's right.
So where they would actually produce a lot of food. But then also that makes me think about a long time ago. I think I was talking to you at some point. I think you said something like that for Paul's getting angry at the Corinthians about hoarding the food, before the rich people are partying with, the food that becomes the Eucharist before everyone else gets to come in, and the poor laborers come in at the end of the day and get the scraps and so on. And that's the Eucharist. And Paul's very upset with them about that. I mean, it makes me think a little bit about kind of our insular church Eucharist is a bit like those Corinthians, that Paul is getting really upset about and saying, well, why are you keeping this from people? Yeah, that's a fascinating insight. And that the bit about modern monetary theory, Catherine Cannon, who's a economist who works with modern monetary theory, said something that struck me. She said, I think she was quoting someone else, but she said, we use the scarcity of the market as an excuse to outsource our ethics. And I thought that was really brilliant because she said, you want to live somewhere, sorry, you can't live there. Well, it's just the market making that decision, not me. Or you want your kids to go to a good school. Well, it's just the market making that decision, not me. Or, you want to sit over here, but no, sorry, you have to pay a certain amount. It's a way to kind of segregate our communities and then pass the bill and pretend it's not an ethical choice. But I think you're so right that these are ethical, and helping the church is a place where we can help people see that these are ethical choices.
Right.
It's hard to say, of course, but it's fascinating.
So generosity.
I do have I've got another question for you, which you may want to take or not take, but a lesser known fact about Walter Brueggemann is that you hold 2 doctorates, one in biblical studies, the other in education. And I was just going to ask you, how do you think, and you can just pass on this too, but how do you think seminary education can and should change in light of all the rapid changes of the past year?
Well, I just read a book by Willie Jennings on racism in theological education. And his big argument is that theological education has to open up to non-white privileged narrative. And of course, Columbia Seminary has been doing that for quite a long time. So I don't know that I have great wisdom about theological education. I think it is a time to get the tools. You have to have the elemental tools that will stay pertinent in many seasons and fashions of the church. So it's not a banking of information, but it has to do with how to think critically, how to think faithfully, how to connect thinking and acting and so on. So I don't think I have any special contribution about that.
So somebody asks, what role do biblical languages play among those tools?
As someone who teaches Hebrew, play a very major role.
Amen. Amen.
If you think about what is distinctively entrusted to the church that nobody else is going to do, it's bearing witness to the meta-narrative of the Bible, and you got to have the tools to do that. So people who graduate from seminary, to my mind, do not need to be able to do everything that everybody else can do. We need particularly to be able to do what is entrusted to us that is entrusted to no one else, and that is to show the pertinence and the vitality and the reliability of the revelation given in the Bible. It seems to me it's non-negotiable. And I think the continuation of biblical languages is a very hard sell. But seminary graduates do not need to be all things to all people. We need to consider what it is that is entrusted to us peculiarly. So that's how I would want to make the argument.
I know that the kind of professionalization of ministry means that people expect pastors to be able to do all things. But one hopes that there are folks in the congregation who know how to balance books and know how to handle or at least help with buildings and grounds and things like that. But no one else is going to learn Hebrew, right?
It seems to be the case.
Yeah. I know that many people here who are joining us, are friends of yours, are students of yours, people who have known you for a long time. How are you doing? It's been a rough year. Are you? How are things?
Well, I'm kind of an introvert, so
Yeah, I was going to say you're reading a lot and you're writing a lot. So yeah,
I'm about to turn 88, and given that, I would say my health is pretty good. All the work I'm doing now is a blog that I work on fairly regularly. I have a few book manuscripts in press yet, but I'm not doing any more book manuscripts, and so I'm living in frozen Michigan, what you might call the good life.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. I do remember you saying before that this is your last book, the Money and Possessions one. You told me in person, you said that's my last one, I'm done. So I'm guessing that this may happen again. We might see a few more in press yet, huh?
Well, two books that I have in press. I wrote a little book called Pivotal Texts in the Book of Exodus. It's in 2 volumes, and the first volume just came out. And what I wanted to do was to point out single verses that would provide keys to reading. And then I have a manuscript in press of pivotal texts in the book of Jeremiah. And I have a half of a manuscript on pivotal texts in Isaiah. And I am glad to say that out of that effort, Westminster John Knox is starting a new series entitled Pivotal Texts. So you'll probably get to write the one on pivotal texts in Ecclesiastes.
All right, I'll look forward to that. That's wonderful. That sounds like a great series. And honestly, if anyone ever preaches on Ecclesiastes ever, that would fill my soul with joy. Most people don't know that's in the Bible. It is actually. But in any event, okay, let me close us. If anyone has any final greetings or questions, feel free to put them up. But we're at our time. But I want to close this. Walter, one of the things that you do that is distinctive is that you are a wordsmith, you are an artist, as well as a biblical scholar. Not only do you preach and teach, but you write beautiful poems that are prayers, and I use them all the time. I read one of your prayers at the beginning of most of my classes that I teach at Columbia Seminary, taken from your many sermons and your many books. So let me close this with this as a little benediction. This is part of the giver of bread and fish from your new book. Here we are in your presence. We ask for bread, the bread of life, the bread of abundance, the bread of neighborly sharing. Do not give us a stone or a crumb. We ask for fish, the fish of a good diet, the fish of your abundant waters, the fish that signs the gospel. Do not give us a snake or the hiss of poison. We dare to pray not because we are at our wits' end, but because you are at the center of our life. Our hope is in no other save in thee alone. So hear, heal, save, restore. Be the God that you have promised to be. Amen. Thanks to everyone for joining. Walter, thank you so much for joining us. Again, deep gratitude from the bottom of my heart for all that you have given to the church, all that you've given to biblical scholarship as a whole, and the ways that you have touched all of our lives who are here a part of this call. We will continue to pray for you, and we will continue to read everything that you write.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
Peace, y'all. Thanks.
Peace.
Peace be with you, Walter.
And with you. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Brueggemann.
Hey, hi.
Chris, thanks for your questions.
Thank you, Walter.
Hi, Joe.
Hey, Joe.
See you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Brueggemann from Davidson.
Hey, good. Thank you. Good.
Thank you, Walter.
Hey, hi. Good.
Hi, Mandy. Thanks.
Hi, Brennan. I'm so grateful that you are continuing that Walter grew me up in as a young seminary. So grateful for both of you.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate it. I every day I'm grateful that I'm at Columbia Theological Seminary, which has been such a wonderful place for me. But also I continue to be grateful that Walter signs all of his books. Walter Brueggemann, Columbia Theological Seminary. It's a great joy for me to even sit in the same office that once a long time ago Walter sat in. And maybe not. I don't know. I'm across the hall at least.
Good.
It was fun to be in Dr. Breed's office one day when he had just brought back stacks and stacks of books, boxes of books from Michigan.
That's right. Remember when I came up there, Walter, Davis and I, and we drove back the whole truckload of books.
I do remember that.
I had fun. I kept some, of course, but I had fun distributing a bunch of those to students who still use them today. So yeah, that was wonderful.
Good.
Walter's generous to a fault, as always.
There have been some extraordinary gifts in the pandemic, even as there's some hardship, and my reconnection to Columbia after being in New England for the last 20 years.
Well, so glad to make your acquaintance on office hours, Mandy, and that's been so wonderful. But yeah, good to see you here too.
Thank you all. Bless.
Good.
Well, peace to y'all. And Walter, thanks again. This was so great for you to take your time, and look forward to hopefully seeing you in maybe Summary, Michigan at some point. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Peace, y'all.